the house on Evergreen Lane. Christmas was always a magical time for me growing up. Twinkling lights on every house, the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafting from kitchens, and the anticipation of gifts under the tree. But the year I spent Christmas at my Aunt Carol's house, that magic turned into something I'd give anything to forget. I was 16 at the time, old enough to feel like Christmas had lost a bit of its shine, but young enough to still enjoy it. My parents had decided to spend the holiday abroad, leaving me in the care of my aunt. Aunt Carol lived in a sleepy little town called Pine Hollow, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. Her house sat on Evergreen Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by woods. I didn't mind spending Christmas there. Aunt Carol was kind, her baking rivaled my mom's, and her house was cozy in that old-fashioned way. But there was one thing that unsettled me. At the end of Evergreen Lane was the Whitlock house. It was massive, more of a mansion than a house, with dark, pointed gables and ivy crawling up its brick walls. The Whitlock family had moved in years ago, but they kept to themselves. I only ever saw glimpses of them. Mr. Whitlock in his long black coat, Mrs. Whitlock with her cold, perfect smile, and their two children, Theo and Lila, who were eerily quiet. "They're different," Aunt Carol had said once, choosing her words carefully. Polite but distant. And strange things always seemed to happen around them. "What kind of strange things?" I'd asked. She hesitated. "Children in the neighborhood. They've gone missing over the years. Always around Christmas." I'd laughed it off at the time. Missing kids seemed more like urban legend material than reality. But as Christmas drew closer, I started noticing things. Late at night, I'd see lights in the Whitlock house, flickering like candle flames. Sometimes, I'd hear faint music drifting from their direction, an old, haunting tune that didn't belong in the cheerful season. And then there was the sack. It appeared on their porch a week before Christmas, a massive red sack, tied shut with a black ribbon. I spotted it while walking home one evening, its size and bulging shape catching my eye. Something about it made me uneasy, as though it wasn't just a sack but something alive. "Maybe it's decorations," Aunt Carol suggested when I mentioned it, but I wasn't so sure. The first child went missing 3 days before Christmas. Tommy, a boy from 2 streets over, vanished while playing outside. His parents found his sled abandoned in the snow, but there was no sign of him. The next night, it was Mia, a girl my age. She'd been walking home from her friend's house when she disappeared. Pine Hollow was in a panic. The police searched the woods, neighbors organized patrols, and parents kept their children inside. That was when I noticed the Whitlock sack had grown. The night before Christmas Eve, I sat by my window, staring at the Whitlock house. Snow was falling in thick, silent flakes, coating the street in white. The sack on their porch was enormous now, the fabric stretched taut. And then I saw him. A man in a red suit emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the brim of his wide hat. He wasn't like any Santa Claus I'd ever seen. His suit was dirty and frayed, and he carried a long black cane. He strode up to the Whitlock house and disappeared inside, dragging the sack behind him. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Aunt Carol and I were baking cookies when there was a knock at the door. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. When she returned, she was holding a small, gold-embossed invitation. "It's from the Whitlocks," she said, her voice tight. "They're hosting a Christmas Eve party tonight." A party? I'd never known the Whitlocks to invite anyone into their home. "I'm not going," Aunt Carol said firmly. "But maybe you should. They might finally open up to someone your age." I didn't want to go, but curiosity got the better of me. That evening, I dressed in my nicest sweater and walked to the Whitlock house. Snow crunched underfoot as I climbed the steps to their massive wooden door. It swung open before I could knock. Theo and Lila stood in the doorway, their pale faces blank and their dark eyes wide. "Welcome," they said in unison, their voices soft and eerie. The inside of the house was even stranger than I'd imagined. The walls were lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me. Candles flickered everywhere, casting long shadows, and the air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic. The Whitlocks greeted me warmly, their smiles just a little too wide. "We're so glad you could join us," Mrs. Whitlock said, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her fingers were icy cold. The party was small, just a few neighborhood kids who looked as uneasy as I felt. The Whitlocks served mulled cider and cookies, but no one ate much. At one point, Mr. Whitlock clinked his glass, drawing everyone's attention. "It's time," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Time for what?" Theo and Lila stepped forward, each holding a corner of the red sack. It was massive now, nearly the size of a couch, and it twitched as though something inside it was alive. "Tonight," Mr. Whitlock said, "we give back to the one who ensures our prosperity. Children, step forward." My heart raced as the room fell silent. The other kids looked confused, but something deep inside me screamed to run. Before anyone could move, the man in the red suit appeared. He seemed to materialize out of the shadows, his grin wide and his eyes glinting like polished coal. The sack shuddered, and a low, guttural sound emanated from within. One by one, the children were pulled toward the man, their movements stiff and unnatural, as though they were being controlled. "No," I whispered, backing away. But Mrs. Whitlock's icy hand clamped onto my arm. "Stay," she said, her smile never wavering. "He'll take what he needs, and the rest of us will be safe for another year." The room began to spin, the candles flickering wildly. The man in the red suit reached into the sack, pulling out something dark and writhing. It wasn't a gift, it was something far worse, something I can't put into words. I don't remember how I got out of that house. I woke up in my bed, Aunt Carol hovering over me. "You were outside," she said, her voice trembling. "In the snow." I tried to tell her what happened, but she didn't believe me. On Christmas morning, the Whitlocks were gone. Their house stood empty, the red sack nowhere to be seen. The missing children were never found. Now, every Christmas, I stay inside with the lights off, hoping the man in the red suit won't come for me next. The Thing in the Chimney. Christmas Eve was always my favorite night of the year. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the kind that clung to you like a warm blanket. But last Christmas Eve, that feeling was different. It wasn't anticipation, it was dread. I was staying at my grandparents' house in a small, snowy town tucked away in the mountains. They'd invited me for the holidays, eager for company after years of celebrating alone. Their house was a cozy, old-fashioned thing, with a large stone fireplace in the living room that had always been the heart of every family gathering. That night, we followed the usual traditions: a big dinner, carols by the fire, and hot chocolate. Grandma even told us stories about how, as kids, she and her siblings would leave cookies for Santa and hear him arrive in the middle of the night. "You could always hear him," she said with a wistful smile, coming down the chimney with a loud thump. "And if you listen carefully, you might hear the reindeer too." We laughed, brushing it off as a sweet story, but something in her tone lingered with me. When everyone finally went to bed, I stayed up in the living room, watching the fire crackle. I liked being alone like that, soaking in the quiet warmth of the house while snow fell outside. It was close to midnight when I first heard it, a faint scraping noise like claws dragging against stone. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe snow slipping off the roof. But then it came again, closer, louder. It was coming from the chimney. I froze, staring at the fireplace. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light onto the walls. There was another sound now, a soft thudding, like something heavy shifting above. My heart started to race. "Maybe it's an animal," I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. "A raccoon or a bird." But raccoons didn't move like this. Whatever it was big. I stepped back, clutching the blanket I'd been wrapped in. The sound grew louder, the scraping turning into a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Then, with a loud thud, something hit the bottom of the chimney. The fire flickered wildly, as if reacting to the sudden presence of whatever had arrived. I couldn't move. For a moment, everything went silent. Then a long, pale hand reached out from the darkness of the fireplace. It wasn't a hand, not really. The fingers were too long, the skin too smooth and white, like it had never seen sunlight. Black claws tipped each finger, curling and uncurling as if testing the air. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, knocking into the coffee table. The sound must have startled it, because the hand froze. Slowly, it retracted into the chimney. I didn't dare move, my eyes glued to the fireplace. My mind raced. Could I run to my grandparents' room? Call for help? But before I could decide, the thing emerged fully. It unfolded itself like a spider crawling out of a hole, its impossibly long limbs bending in unnatural angles. Its body was tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered, blackened cloth that looked like it had once been festive. A garland hung loosely around its neck, but it was brittle and gray, like it had been left to rot for decades. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel it staring at me. The room grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs as the fire dimmed further, almost extinguished. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it reached into the folds of its tattered clothing and pulled out a sack. The sack was old and torn, but it squirmed, as though something inside it was alive. It opened the sack, and a foul stench filled the room, like rot and decay. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to vomit. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound that I realized was laughter. It reached into the sack and pulled out something. A doll. But it wasn't any ordinary doll. It looked exactly like me. Same hair, same clothes. Its glassy eyes stared at me lifelessly, its mouth sewn shut with thick black thread. The creature held the doll up, tilting its head again, almost like it was comparing the doll to me. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It tore the doll's head off. Pain exploded in my chest, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. It felt like something was being ripped out of me, like the doll wasn't just a toy but a piece of me. The creature stuffed the headless doll back into its sack and reached out with one clawed hand. "No," I croaked, scrambling backward. But it didn't stop. Its hand was inches from my face when a loud sound rang out. A bell, deep and resonant, echoing through the house. The creature froze, its head snapping toward the direction of the sound. The bell rang again, and the creature hissed, retreating into the shadows of the fireplace. It was gone as quickly as it had come. The fire roared back to life, and the warmth returned to the room. But the smell lingered, a reminder that what I'd seen wasn't a dream. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my grandparents what had happened, expecting them to laugh or tell me I'd imagined it. But they didn't. Instead, they exchanged a long, knowing look. "Every family has its stories," Grandma said quietly. "Ours is the chimney keeper." "The what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "A creature that comes down the chimney on Christmas Eve," Grandpa said, his voice grave. "It doesn't take gifts, it takes pieces of you. Your soul, your essence. It's said to prey on those who are alone, who feel forgotten during the holidays." I stared at them, disbelief and terror flooding me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "We thought it was just a story," Grandma said, her hands trembling. "It hadn't happened in so long. We thought we were safe. That was last Christmas. This year, I refuse to light a fire. The chimney is sealed shut, and I don't dare stay up late on Christmas Eve. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I think I hear it. The scraping, the growling, and I wonder if it's coming for me again."